Good choice.
Ah, there he is. The very important man.
Despite its status as a beloved and still currently active D&D setting, Eberron has only ever received 2 video games. One of them is an MMO, which as a rule means I don't plan on covering it on this channel. The other is today's subject, Dragonshard. It is the very first D&D RTS ever made, or so it will tell you. Honestly, this marketing label is one of the more laughably easy to disprove lies I've ever seen. Dragonshard isn't even the first Warcraft-style RTS in D&D, and that's before you factor in nearly a half-dozen other D&D strategy games from the 90s. Coming out in 2005, Dragonshard had plenty of potential. Eberron is, after all, uniquely well-suited out of all the D&D settings for a real-time strategy game. And while the game to this day is remembered somewhat fondly, it did ultimately fail to utilize Eberron to its full potential. It's largely lore accurate aside from some minor problems, but that's not really the issue. The problem is that the game managed to hide the majority of the unique strengths of one of D&D's most distinctive settings. And while this means that for most video gamers, Eberron hasn't got much in the way of content to work with, fret not, because Eberron is far from a dead setting like Dark Sun. The world of magical technology and fantasy nation-states vying for power in the interim of 2 great wars is, as it has always been, best experienced through tabletop. And to help breathe life into this world of industrial magic, we have today's sponsor, Chepeku. Chepeku is a team of fantasy battle map makers that make set pieces for your tabletop games. You'll be able to take advantage of their amazing library of thousands of maps however you like to play your games. They're 100% compatible with every virtual tabletop, and they're printer friendly if you really want to spoil your players. Now, Eberron is a mishmash of interwar Europe and the colonial eras, so if you want to really bring this thing to life and give your game the polish that it deserves, we're going to want to snag maps out of their library like the Monster Genealogy Lab for Margrave University encounters, the Warforged City Center map for some of our urban encounters, and the Archaeological Dig map for, well, your archaeological digs, naturally. And these maps, as well as the hundreds more that you can access through Chepeku, all have variations. So these things are highly modular for anything you might want to run. Because that's really the beauty of Chepeku. They've got so many maps for any occasion you might want, whether it be beautifully illustrated full dungeons or handcrafted single encounters. So, how exactly do you gain access? They run things primarily through Patreon. You'll click through my link in the description or pinned comment, set yourself up with the Master Cartography tier membership, and you'll gain access immediately to years of map packs. Plus, a new one each week. Oh, but wait, hang on, what's this tier over here? Did they just say animated battle maps? Oh yeah, you bet they did. These things are obscenely cool, and are sure to impress your players in all your virtual tables. So thanks once again to Chepeku for sponsoring this video. And let's get diving into Eberron and Dragonshard. Dragonshard is the kind of video game where I would typically avoid giving a lore outline for its setting, mostly because it doesn't use very much of that setting. But in this case, I'm forced to make an exception. Dragonshard is really the only chance we're gonna get on this channel to discuss Eberron. I have come to view it as my divinely ordained duty to teach tabletop history and lore to a video game audience. And thus, I would not be doing my job if I wasted the opportunity to outline the broad strokes of one of D&D's most influential settings. Maybe you've noticed the way that things like artificers and warforged have become increasingly common in D&D over the years. That's all Eberron, baby. It's so popular, it's managed to warp the main Forgotten Realms setting to be more like it. That's what we call soft power. In 2002, Wizards of the Coast held a contest called the Fantasy Setting Search, hunting for a brand new D&D setting created by outside talent. According to Charles Ryan via his Reddit account, they expected upwards of 4,000 submissions in the first round of the contest. To make this easier on themselves, they chose to create very strict rules around page formatting for the one-page setting pitch. The hope was to make most of the submissions easier to process by allowing most of the rabble to, disqualify themselves by not following the format. Instead, what they received was 11,000 submissions, nearly triple what they expected. Pretty much all of them sticking perfectly to the format. Several more rounds of the contest went by, where the designers would be expected to expand their pitch more and more until the final trio were each paid a total of $20,000 to write a 100-page setting Bible. The winner of this mass undertaking was Keith Baker, bringing us the Magitech setting of Eberron. Now, a little historical footnote here about this contest is that one of the runner-ups, despite not winning, was a guy named Rich Burlew, who was actually able to convert his reputation as a finalist into a base of D&D readership when he started the legendary and long-lived webcomic series, The Order of the Stick, in 2003. Anyway, part of the appeal of why Eberron won and became a hit setting was its commitment to being kitchen sink fantasy. Every core book in every edition of D&D is very upfront about Eberron. If it exists in a D&D book anywhere at all, you can put it in your Eberron game. The setting is very well defined, but with very intentional gaps for you to write in. Let's get into the meat of it. Eberron, it ain't high fantasy. Eberron is what comes after high fantasy. This is a world where magic has advanced at a similar pace to how tech moves for us. The countryside is an idyllic rural frontier, bisected by roaring lightning rails. Meanwhile, the vast urban centers are all bustling factory towns, powered by a magically educated middle class. The unique class that this setting offers is the Artificers, the specialists who have turned spellcasting and enchantment into a rigorous science, creating contraptions and machines to solve any problem. The other big contribution to D&D is the Warforged, which at the end of the day are essentially fantasy war droids who were, up until recently, mass-produced to fight in the last war. They're fully sentient, and with international arms treaties now giving all of them emancipation, they now have to find their place in a world that has only ever treated them as weapons.
I am not a gun.
Both of these elements have actually been sort of soft co-opted into the Forgotten Realms. Artificers and Warforged are accepted and encouraged as player character options, even if it's not always extremely clear how they got there. Back to Eberron, it's framed largely through the POV of the continent of Corvair, a bustling industrial hub of teeming cities, lightning-powered transport networks, and ambitious nation-states. But Corvair is more than an industrial heartland. It's also a powder keg waiting to explode. You see, an uneasy peace hangs over the continent, which has only recently signed a treaty to end a cataclysmic war. 100 years before, Corvair was dominated by one human kingdom, Galifar. This continent was theirs, even if only the Heartlands were held with much in the way of central authority. Eventually, as is so often the case with kingdoms, a succession crisis broke out. The 5 provinces at the heart of Galifar each made their play for power, hoping to seize the throne of Galifar for themselves. Seer, the home of high culture. Ondair, the land of learning and scholarship. Brayland, urban heart of the continent, Karnath, the military autocracy, and Thrain, the zealous birthplace of a new religion. The war is harder than anyone could have known, and their industrial weapons far deadlier than was feared. The conflict killed at rates that no one could have imagined, a war so vast and devastating that none alive could conceive of another conflict breaking out ever again. They would naively come to call it the Last War. Although it mirrors the First World War, the First World War didn't have magic. In our timeline, when nations buckled under the strain, they fell to pieces before they could collapse entirely. World War I couldn't have been kept up for all that much longer. Not so in the Last War. When Karnath, the nation of warriors, found themselves starving and destitute, they still had options that nations in our world did not. Karnath had necromancy. And when other nations found their own pools of new recruits dwindling as 4 generations, one after another, lined up and died in arcane trenches, House Cannith introduced Warforged to solve the crisis and prolong the war by decades. House Cannith, by the way, is one of the dragon-marked houses who have these magical marks that give them large advantages, mostly economical ones. They're somewhere between Noble House and Megacorp. And knowing about the dragon-marked houses is important to understanding Eberron, but I'm not going to deep dive into them today because that's more internal politics, and we're trying to keep this broad. The 5 provinces cracked and fragmented, losing control of their front lines. Elven and goblin mercenaries revolted and seized their own realms. Hags invaded and established a homeland for monsters. Refugees fled the conflict, settling the far corners of Corvair. And still, though the nations diminished and millions died, the war seemed, after a century, as if it might never truly end. But end it had to. Not in triumph, but in calamity. In recent years, great battles had been fought in the nation of Seer, which would become the center of what would come to be called the Day of Mourning. Seer was the crown jewel of the continent, the land of songs and poems, of bards and courtships. And in a single day, it shattered. A wave of magical energy, the source unknown, rippled across the nation, wiping them out and flooding the land with wretched monsters and the vengeful ghosts of those who died in the cataclysm. Where once there stood the kingdom of Seer, a nation of millions, the Mournlands were all that remained. No one truly knows what caused it, and the devs have left it open to interpretation. But the Day of Mourning was the shock that was required to finally force the nations to sign a peace treaty, acknowledging that Galifar was finally no more, and each of the independent territories were therefore rightfully sovereign. The war had changed these places, kept them all in isolation from each other for 100 years, developing national identities that became far more important than the racial divisions of classical D&D. 5 feudal provinces entered the war. Over a dozen nation-states emerged after. Every rendition of Eberron begins the game 1 year after the Treaty of Thronehold is signed, declaring peace in Corvair. The canon has never been moved forward, as the fate of Eberron is meant to be in the player's hands, not in the hands of the writers. What you are given at your table is an unstable political deadlock to serve as your sandbox. There is a consensus echoing across the continent, a terrifying and inescapable destiny hanging over the lives of millions. No one won the last war. And so, there will be a next war. Eberron resembles interwar Europe, but somehow even less stable. In a world where there were a handful of powers who kind of won World War I, in Eberron there were no victors. In this new state of affairs, peace is merely a chance to scramble for dominance through different means. The weapons of war have changed from legions of warforged and arcane fortresses to small bands of adventurers who know how to be discreet. And that's where you come in. The frontiers hold ancient secrets, the Mournlands scream with enigmas, and tales of faraway continents full of rare magical resources seduce the greedy. Eberron is a setting of factions, and there's no escaping the politics of the time. There are always those who would hire you to do their dirty work, and even more who would try and stop you. Eberron chiefly supports 2 broad styles of story, though you're never forced to be constrained to them. The first is noir, the cigar-scented tales of crime and politicking in the cities of Eberron. These adventures offer intrigue mixed with complex moral choices where you can't really choose a good or an evil side, and you definitely can't know who you can trust. The second mode of play is pulp adventure, high-powered fantastical action leaving all your doubts and your need for irony at the door. Think Indiana Jones trying to discover lost artifacts from under the nose of various political organizations who would use them for evil. That is the broad strokes of Eberron, where our games take place. If you want a little bit more on how the political setup of all this works, I would recommend Dungeon Masterpiece's video on the geopolitics of Eberron, from the perspective of a man with an actual degree in geopolitics. I'll throw a link to it in the description. Now, before we get into the Eberron RTS, we should address the name. What's a Dragonshard? The creation myth of Eberron is that there were 3 cosmic dragons: Sybaris, Kyber, and Eberron. Kyber murdered Sybaris and then shattered him into pieces.
See if it works. Oh yes, it goes in beautifully.
And Eberron said, "Don't worry, Kyber, it's fine. I forgive you. Now, come on, let's hug it out. Now, go to sleep, go. Shh, it's okay. Don't worry, it won't hurt anymore. Eberron's body turned into a shell surrounding Kyber. Eberron became the surface of a new planet. Kyber became the vast corrupted underworld hiding in shrieking tunnels just below the surface. Meanwhile, Sybaris became a radiant golden ring surrounding the planet. Each of these 3 environs produce dragon shards, which are a key component in various magical industries. Eberron shards are easy enough to get because, that crap grows everywhere. Kyber shards are dangerous because you have to send adventurers pretty deep underground, but it's still doable. The harder shards to get are naturally the ones from Sybaris because they're in space. Mostly, however, these will crash down into Eberron as meteors, though only around the equator. And the continent of Corvair is notably not on the equator. So the hunt for Sybaris shards sends adventurers and treasure seekers south into the dangerous and teeming jungles of the continent of Zendrick. And that's where we come in, beginning the game of Dragonshard as a military intervention into a third world nation in search of resources we can sell back home to various arms industries so that belligerent nation states can stockpile weapons of mass destruction.
Are we the baddies?
Now, before we dive into the game itself, just wanted to give everyone a quick thanks for stepping up on the Patreon lately. We've hit that goal of $300 a month, which gives me just enough resources over top of my bills that I can start putting together a stream kit. It's still probably not going to be till March till I'm ready and I've got all my gear and stream assets gathered, but a big thank you to all of you for the support, and I can't wait to stream my playtests for you. I reckon we're going to start with Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance, since that seems to be one of the more stream-friendly D&D games. Also, I think I'm probably just going to end up streaming here on YouTube, but I'm not decided yet. I'll keep you guys in the loop, and if you've got preferences on where you want me to stream, please leave a comment down below. Thanks everyone, the wave of support after I set that Patreon target has been amazing. You guys are the best. And I also gotta spread the love a bit. It's no secret that D&D is our main topic on this channel, which can leave franchises like Warhammer a little bit underserved. Well, one of my real-life friends just started a YouTube channel with an amazing video about Boltgun. It's really good, and I'd appreciate it if you would all take a second after this video to go check out Mr. Zosh's debut video and see what he has to say about the big boys in blue. Now, let's get back to the action. Our jungle expedition isn't just planning on collecting dragon shards. We're here to capture the Dragonshard, a massive chunk called the Heart of Sybaris. On the face of it, a military expedition to retrieve this thing from the steaming jungles of the south is a pretty good concept for the pulp mode of Eberron storytelling, if done right. But Dragonshard doesn't quite do it right. See, Dragonshard kind of wastes Eberron by fixating very heavily on the least unique elements of the setting. You're not on an expedition from any of the warring nation-states of Eberron, nor are you an independent expedition who's reliant on the funding of scheming factions back home. No, you are the Order of the Flame, a military wing of the Church of the Flame, who are the new church I mentioned earlier based in Thrain. But this is still an independent church. We're not being sent here by Thrain. We're sorta like if Kenneth Copeland brought a private army to Iraq for oil. The choice to use this as our setup kind of takes all the intrigue out of Eberron. There's no competing expeditions, no double crosses from your expeditionary sponsors. It's really just a bunch of paladins in medieval armor running around and shouting, "For the Order!" Sure, they brought some artificers and war golems with them, but their presence alone isn't enough to make this truly an Eberron story. In a setting about a nuanced and complex magical war, with skyships and lightning rails, it's such a waste to have created an RTS that comes off this straightforwardly medieval. The Order, however, aren't the only faction in the game, naturally. There are also the lizard folk who have been guarding the heart of Sybaris for centuries. They believe that the heart was gifted to them by the Dragon Fathers, and that the heart lifted them to sentience with its magic. Their entire civilization is built around this heart, and they're not gonna give it up easy. The final playable army is the Umbragen. These are a faction of drow on Zendrik who are currently fighting a losing war against an army of beholders, mind flayers, and other monsters. They need a weapon to avoid losing their shrouded homeland to the invaders. The Order and the Lizard Folk both have short 7-mission single-player campaigns. The Umbragen, curiously, do not. An old IGN article from before launch mentioned that there was an expansion planned that would add a co-op mode. So I suspect that the Umbragen campaign was intended to launch with that expansion, though we never did end up getting it. Now, when we first start the game up, there are two things that will pop out as obvious. The first is that this game is remarkably well polished. The colors and the designs look great. And there's these minor little details like cloth physics and units clearing snow paths as they walk that suggest the team put a tremendous amount of work and love into this title. The second thing you notice when you look closely is, this game looks a lot like Warcraft, don't it? Now, despite what it looks like, this isn't entirely them ripping off Warcraft 3. If you follow the lineage of Liquid Entertainment games backwards, we see that Dragonshard has the same art style as a Lord of the Rings RTS. No, not the one you remember, a different one. But this art style doesn't originate in that RTS either. It originates in their first game, Battle Realms, which notably predates Warcraft 3 by less than a year. So thus, we can't really argue that Liquid's RTS games are copying Warcraft 3 visually. We have to argue that they're stealing the style of Warcraft 2! Anyway, despite looking like a sister game to the Warcraft franchise, Dragonshard doesn't quite have the art direction to look as good, despite all the polish. The place where this is most obvious is the human protagonist, Lady Marin. It's impossible to deny that they wanted her to look like a Warcraft 3 character. She looks like they tried to find a way to merge Jaina and Arthas into one terrible design. From the front and standing still, this is mostly passable as a character model. But the second we see her from the back or when she's moving, it gets outright laughable. She's simultaneously got a backless dress and Warcraft-style shoulder pads, and the result is that those shoulder pads are clearly floating. And why does she move like this? Lady Marin, you are not wearing heavy armor. You're pretty much naked except for the shoulder pads. Lady Marin is a truly ridiculous character design, and the way that she seems almost like a parody of the most outrageous parts of Warcraft armor, she kinda loops back around and becomes amazing again. I actually can't hate Lady Marin, she's so goddamn goofy. Despite all the Warcraft comparisons, both good and bad, there's no denying that Dragonshard is still a beautiful looking RTS. From the buildings, to the terrain, to the fine details on the unit models. Moving to the sound side of things, we'll start with the music. It's solid, and it manages to do a pretty good job making D&D style music work with an RTS. It's big and boisterous in the way that you need in this genre. Critically though, I actually think they do too good of a job making all the faction music feel linked. It feels like each faction only got one song, even though that's not remotely the case. Voice work has always been a strength for this studio. But like their previous game, the good side is pretty dull, and all the interesting voice stuff went to the inhuman factions. The Order doesn't even have fun unit personalities to go with their voice work. It's various flavors of shouting surface level details about their character, such as the Artificer being hyperfixated on being so very old.
I hear you need someone with experience. I'm not gonna wait around to die.
Where shall I go? Let's go! Move out! This is more than a one-man job!
The other factions ended up getting so much more room for characterization.
Please let there be a target.
Overall, the presentation is great, but that's almost to be expected from this studio. It's always been the gameplay where Liquid struggled, and this game is no different. Perhaps it was for the best that they chose to hang up their RTS hat after Dragonshard, and make games like Desperate Housewives. That seems like a rather drastic tonal shift, doesn't it? Now, I'm not going to be outrageously cruel to the gameplay. It's janky, and I honestly don't believe it works all that well. But it's also experimental as hell, and it had a lot of ideas in it that clearly had a spark of brilliance in them. It's really just that the execution on those experiments didn't quite work out. But as I said, I'm not going to fault Dragonshard all that badly, because this really was a neat attempt to bring the design pillars of Dungeons & Dragons to an RTS. To understand the core of how Dragonshard works, I think it's best that we start with the resources. There are two. The first is the titular Dragon Shards, which will periodically crash into the map in dramatic meteor showers. This essentially makes them the infinite resource of this game, even if you'll sometimes need to fight a bit over control of wherever they fall. The more finite resource of this game is gold. You get a small amount that trickles in through the taxation from your buildings, but generally speaking, it's only enough to replace the occasional lost unit. You're not going to have a lot of luck if you're just trying to build a full army off of your tax income. The main source of gold is going underground and hunting for treasure in dungeons. And other than some respawning monsters to add a small trickle of gold, once the treasure is all taken from the underworld, there isn't any more gold to be had. The result is an RTS which encourages very stingy gameplay. On most maps, there's enough for you to build a base, some expansions, and an army, while still having enough left over to replace heavy losses a couple of times. The result is that you will need to pick your battles very carefully, and try to only take decisive battles that you know you can win. Every unit is precious because they are expensive to replace, and there's a soft limit to how long you can keep mass recruiting. If you let a map drag on for too long, you'll be left with an empty treasury, and it's going to be extremely tough to keep your army at full pop off of just tax income alone. And this isn't bad, by the way, it's just an economic choice that colors the strategy of this title. In Dragonshard, it's a bad plan to fight unless you have a lot to gain. Now, hold on, I mentioned dungeons earlier. That's really the big brilliant innovation in this game. Each map is made up of two distinct layers, an overground and an underground. Not only that, but your units will act very differently in each zone. There are three types of units in this game. Champions, which are your hero-type units, ultimates, which are your one-off massive mega units, and captains, which are your common troops. Of these three types of units, all but the ultimates can enter Kyber and go dungeon diving. Unless it's a unit that can fly, they have to stay on the surface. Now here's where the core of this game really comes out. Captains are called that for a reason. As you gain XP and level up their buildings, captains will begin recruiting additional troops into their squads. This means that your battles will be with proper armies, with upwards of 120 units per side smacking each other around on the battlefield. This changes down in Kyber. When captains enter the underworld, they leave their troops behind, and they start to resemble more of an adventuring party that you guide through the ruined tunnels, disarming traps, finding treasure, and finishing quests. The result is a game that is a large-scale squad-based RTS above ground and a smaller-scale dungeon crawler below the surface. This is innately cool, and it's a brilliant way to adapt D&D into an RTS. So honestly, huge compliments to the designers who dreamed this up. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work very well in practice. Ultimately, the squad-based stuff on the surface just doesn't hold up, at all. Especially when you consider that Dawn of War had just come out the previous year. When combat begins, you're staring at a screen with 200 unit models smashing together. it's pretty much impossible to know what the hell is happening. What do I do with all this information on screen? What am I supposed to be doing? The overall clusterfuck of overworld combat, and the fact that each captain has like 3 different abilities they can use, means that Dragonshard's mechanics are overwhelming and practically impossible to engage with at a beginner level. By the end of my time with the game, I ended up needing to compromise and just purposefully disregard the majority of combat in favor of microing just my champion and a handful of units with useful AoE attacks. Trying to reach a true intermediate skill level on Dragonshard is the kind of task that will take really a surprising amount of work, not to mention a brain capable of registering a wild amount of information at once. Meanwhile, combat below ground is so much more manageable, and it feels like what the game's combat ought to have been. You can actually comprehend what's going on down here, and you can maneuver your units around each other for maximum effect. Even so, much like the overground combat, it's just too big. There's too many units. The dungeon crawl is neat at the very beginning of each level. You know, when you've got like 5 guys clearing the opening areas. Everyone has to use their abilities in clever ways. It's a proper dungeon crawler. But that only lasts for around 2 minutes per map, because you'll quickly have to reinforce your underground expedition with dozens of units. At which point, the dungeon crawl just feels like a normal RTS. Usually a dungeon crawl works best when you've got a small number of pieces with consequential teamwork abilities. It does not work when you've got 20 guys berserking down the halls of the underworld. Kyber was supposed to be a dungeon crawling mechanic, but in the end, it's just a second RTS map where you can actually understand what's going on, and also you'll need a rogue to open chests and disarm traps. And really, it's a tragedy, because a little bit of testing before they fully committed to this setup probably would have fixed the problem without much lost dev time. Every faction has 4 heroes. They easily could have just said, "Sorry folks, Kyber's too dangerous for regular troops, only heroes can enter." This would let you get all the goodness of the dungeon system without losing the dungeon crawler feeling with, a mob of units. Meanwhile, the overworld would no longer require the squads in order to differentiate the gameplay from Kyber. So you could just have the squad leaders, and thus the overworld combat would be larger scale than the underworld, while still being readable. Closing gameplay statements, and really just a pair of them. They're all positive, but also kind of miscellaneous. Factions really nail their asymmetry in this game. Every army has similar abilities, but you're going to find them mixed onto different units, plus some unique stuff on each side. This is satisfying asymmetry, and it feels balanced. Unique champion artifacts can be found around the campaign if you complete certain objectives as specific heroes. This is cool. I like it, and it gives my brain these weird chemical signals, pulling me to try replaying missions to collect the cool stuff. Alright, let's return to the story that we were chatting about way earlier. The human campaign. It's boring as sin. When I complained earlier that they toned down all the intrigue and such that makes Eberron unique, you might have thought they added something exciting to replace it. Because there's the approach that you don't have to stick to the source material if you put in something to make it interesting. But not in this case, they did not do that. It's just a fetch quest for 3 seals of light to crack open the protective seals holding the heart of Sybaris. There's a brief complication when the Umbragens steal one of the seals from you, but that's all. You go get the seal back, and it really wasn't any trouble. The final mission is kind of neat though, just from a mechanical perspective. Each faction has a different win condition, and you'll need to stop each of the enemies from completing their own unique objective while pursuing your own win cons. Otherwise, the Order campaign is pretty straightforward. Nothing is complicated here. You go there, you get this, etc, etc. Everyone screams for the Order a lot, and then they take the shard home, where I presume it gets repurposed into some form of super weapon, which triggers the next war and wipes out millions more lives.
So, how do we get this back home?
Then we hit the harder of the 2 campaigns. This time, it's from the lizard folk POV, and it's significantly more interesting. The Order was just a bunch of bland treasure hunters hoping to make a megachurch richer. The stakes, however, are much larger for the lizard folk. The story begins when the four protagonists realize that these invading religious zealots are slaughtering their villagers. Apparently, these guys really want to know where our greatest religious artifact is so that they can find a way to turn it into guns or something. Also, a band of strange dark elves are emerging from the ground and pillaging everything we own as well. Things seem a little bit more drastic this time around, don't they? Hopelessly outmatched after a long stretch of peace, the shaman Wowan declares that the best way to serve the Dragon Fathers and protect their civilization is to seek out Darok, an ancient hero of their people. He is resurrected, and for a time he teaches us the ancient ways of war, mostly putting archers on dinosaurs. In time, we reach that final mission, and I play 4D chess, allowing the Umbra to drain the shard's power while the Order charges it to take control. The result is that the charge meter of the shard does not move a single inch, while I have a swarm of pterodactyl riders dive bomb the enemy bases.
Please let there be a target!
In the end, as I must reiterate, Dragonshard was mostly lore accurate, aside from a few errors. For example, the dragon shards that come from meteors are supposed to be gold in color. They come from a gold dragon. And yeah, I get that blue crystals probably look prettier, but I don't view that as any real excuse, because the superior color of collectible crystals is green.
An energy crystal has been found.
But how closely it stuck to the existing lore didn't really affect the fact that this game just didn't feel like Eberron in any meaningful way. It's basically indistinguishable from normal high fantasy. A more Eberron version of Dragonshard would either have been set during the last war, or if not, then at least a greater effort should have been made to incorporate the politics of the setting. For example, with some work, the human campaign in this game could have been much improved just by making Lady Marin the leader of an international expeditionary coalition. It could come to fragment and turn on each other, some because of greed, others because of patriotism to their nations, as they got closer to the heart of Sybaris. Marin might have, in the end, returned the heart of Sybaris to the Lizardmen, after realizing that it would only do evil in the hands of her people. This would have done a better job drawing from Pulp Fiction and treasure hunt stories like Indiana Jones or The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, as well as honestly just being a better overall story than the one we got, which was basically, we did it, Patrick, we saved all the oil in the Middle East! Thanks for watching, everyone. I'm still hoping another Eberron game will be released one day, so we can continue to dive into the lore. But for now, I hope you enjoyed this video, and please consider leaving a like if you did. Remember to check out the Zoshbox debut video about Bolt Gun, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next one.